This is Bishop Michael Burbidge, and you are listening to the Walk Humbly Podcast.
Welcome to the Walk Humbly Podcast. I'm Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese and your co-host. If you haven't already, please make sure you rate this podcast and write a review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and we're now on Overcast as well. Sign up for our e-newsletter at arlingtondiocese.org, and you can follow Bishop Burbidge on Twitter. More than 15,000 of you already do, actually well over 15,000 already do, at Bishop Burbidge. You can also send questions for consideration on this podcast. We answer questions at the end. Email us info@arlingtondiocese.org. Again, info@arlingtondiocese.org. I welcome your host, Bishop Burbidge. Bishop, how are you?
I'm doing well, Billy. Just got back yesterday from being at our General Assembly meeting, being with my brother bishops from around the country. It's always great to be with them and spend time with them. But I got back last night after a full week of discussions and deliberations. So good to be back home.
Yeah, it was a more focused meeting, but it was thorough. Lots of things were discussed, and that's going to be the whole focus of this episode is the General Assembly meeting. So as many listeners know, this past week the U.S. bishops gathered in Baltimore for the Fall General Assembly, and the agenda was focused exclusively on the sexual abuse crisis, almost exclusively. A couple of the topics were covered. And a lot of the focus was about accountability of bishops, how allegations against them are handled, as well as instances of mismanagement of priest abuse cases. Bishop, please take us through how the bishops began the session. The surprise announcement that came on day one obviously was big news, and then what your reaction was to that announcement.
Yes, so we began our official gathering, our assembly, on Monday, and we had already decided that entire day was going to be devoted to prayer. Prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, rosary, confessions were available for the priests, reflections were offered, including speakers who spoke to us, and then Mass, the day concluded with Mass at 5. So we knew we were going to begin our assembly in that way, which is really the first time we've ever began a November assembly with a day dedicated to prayer. I think it's a good pattern we might consider for the future. But right after the opening prayer in the assembly room, where we gathered first before we began the day of prayer, Cardinal DiNardo made an announcement. And by now, I'm sure all of our listeners are aware of that announcement, telling us that the two action items that we were going to vote on, they were action items which would require a vote. We've been asked to delay that vote, until after the Holy Father meets with the leaders of bishops' conferences from around the world. And so those two action items were going to be standard of conducts for bishops, which we had well in advance of the meeting, and also the accountability, what that would look like maybe through a lay commission. So
what was your reaction to that? Obviously, that everyone was ready going into November. We had even discussed it on this podcast, that was really the agenda, was to make votes, to be ready to hit the ground running.
Right. It caught all of us completely by surprise. We were turning to each other. It was like, what did he just say? Because none of us heard or anticipated that announcement. In fact, Cardinal DiNardo said he did not receive it from the Congregation for Bishops until Sunday evening. So we were very disappointed, because as I told the faithful going into the meeting, we knew very, very clearly that we had to come out of this meeting with concrete steps and actions. So we were very disappointed and surprised. Fortunately, maybe it's divine providence, we went from that announcement to begin our day of prayer. And I really think that probably was a good thing.
Yeah.
Because I think it did help us to regroup a little bit, put things in perspective, gain the wisdom of what we needed to move forward.
So kind of jumping ahead a little bit, coming out of it, so initially there was this disappointment and surprise by a lot of bishops. Coming out of it, how do you feel?
Well, it was, the days continued to discuss the crisis in a very honest, in a very frank way, and allow us to also pursue discussion of what we were going to vote upon. And so I felt that we came out with a really strong opinion that, yes, we agree. We agree with everything we've been hearing from all the faithful in the listening sessions. Something has to change. And so that standard of conduct for bishops, which really is very specific behavior that build upon the promises, of course, we made at ordination, sure, that's healthy. That's a good thing for us, and we very much want that. We also recognize that, as we've instructed our faithful, that as the charter was approved in 2002, it did not include bishops. We understand that it needs to. That when there's an accusation of mishandling a case or misconduct of a bishop, there should be that same accountability and reviewed by an outside source. And the suggestion we were going to talk about was this special lay commission of independent law enforcement and investigative and social service experts to pursue such allegations. And Billy, from everything that I heard from the floor, and our listeners were able to hear many of the bishops speak on these topics, we are in favor of that. We agree that is something that should be done. So the fact that the vote was postponed, that it was delayed, right, regrettably, I think, right. But the fact that it was postponed in no way prohibited us from making it very clear to the Cardinal Donato that when he goes to that February meeting, we really want to take these steps forward.
I watched a lot of interviews of bishops, coming out of the assembly and, and speaking with you. It was clear that while a vote didn't happen, the resolve of the bishops is the same as if they had voted on it. I mean, so there wasn't this clear vote, but there is this strong resolve that this is the direction that we need to go. And I think it's probably very helpful for Cardinal Donato going to this meeting of the heads of Episcopal conferences from throughout the world to meet with the Holy Father, that he has that full support. There isn't like a split vote or a split, mind of the bishops. It's clear what the mandate is for him going into that.
That these two major action items.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think the Cardinal also heard clearly from the bishops that, and in a timely manner, like we knew all along that going into this meeting that our vote, if we were able to vote upon these action items, it still needed to be approved by Rome.
Right.
So we understood that. So I think the Cardinal goes with, this is really the voice of our bishops, and there really is a sense of urgency here in the United States that our lay faithful see our commitment to that.
And I saw an interview that you did with a major news outlet on television, and you had talked about going into it the day of prayer, but then you talked about some of the groups that spoke before the real discussion began of the bishops, the National Review Board, the Lay Advisory Committee, and then also victims. And it was clear in that interview how impactful that was for you going in. Talk a little bit about what you heard from those groups and what that did for you.
Yeah, because a major part of this November meeting, unlike other ones, was listening. We all went into the meeting having listened to the faithful of our diocese, and I'm so grateful to our clergy, our religious, our seminarians, our lay people who participated in those sessions. But we went into the November meeting with that commitment. We are going also to listen. And so during the prayer day, for example, 2 victims spoke to us in the course of the prayer day in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament.
Wow.
And we heard their stories, and we heard the horrific consequences of the abuse that the abuse had on them and their families. And, whenever I speak with victims, it's so important to hear those stories. It's very difficult emotionally. You can imagine the sadness you feel when you hear these courageous people telling their stories. Of how the church has hurt them, and members within the church and leaders within the church have hurt them. It's very difficult to hear that, but it's important for us to hear it. And those 2 victims who spoke to us, I am sure victims, survivors from around the country, were very proud of them. Like that their voice represented so many people, and they spoke very directly, very candidly to the bishops, and very much challenged us, and made it very clear that this recommitment that we all continue to make to eradicate sexual abuse, to be transparent, to support victims, that every day we have to renew that commitment. So I was challenged. I was saddened to hear those stories, but I was also inspired. They did touch our hearts. They really did. And then we had a lay woman, again, speak to us, representing the lay faithful throughout the country. What she has heard from youth and young adults and ministers, and what we need to do as bishops. So just being reaffirmed. And then a woman, religious, also spoke to us. So it was very challenging. But we needed to hear those voices, and we listened attentively, respectively, and were moved to recommitment and renewal to all that we have promised.
And since you were ordained a bishop, you've probably never had a General Assembly like this, in that usually many, many topics are brought forward. Lots of things are voted on and discussed. And so this one was focused almost exclusively on this. There was one other topic that we'll get to in a minute, but was that focus helpful, that there weren't other topics being discussed? This is like really the head of the spear. This is what we want to accomplish while we're here. Was that helpful?
Yeah, it was extremely helpful because it was very clear that this was not business as usual. This was not business as usual. We have a crisis on our hands. We need to address it aggressively and to take concrete steps. And we spoke to each other. This was in my 16 years going to bishop meetings. This was the most that we ever spoke to other fraternally, challenging each other and speaking heart to heart, and that was very powerful. And I'm sure our listeners heard, if they were watching the meeting on television, they heard bishops saying to each other, we're accountable to each other too. And if we see misconduct or we see mishandling, we got to call it out. We have to be firm that way. That's an act, as difficult as it may be. It's an act of love for the church. It's really an act of love for one another. It's an act of love, most of all, for the people of God. And so there was the whole idea of fraternal correction was very strong.
Yeah, I'd never heard that before, because I'd seen it. I knew it was part of the charter. It was one of the documents that came out of that whole discussion in 2002. But I'd never heard bishops really directly address that. I would assume it's kind of uncomfortable, even to talk about keeping each other accountable, because that's a tough conversation. But many bishops got up to the mic and really drove that point home. And
it was really, we were reminded to it, like I often say, it was part of in addition to the 2002 charter and essential norms, there was an episcopal commitment.
Right.
That's the third document that always gets lost in the 2002 discussion.
Right.
That we did promise that. And so we were just kind of reminding each other of that.
Yeah. Now, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and even though the action items were not voted upon, the standard of conduct for bishops is a daily promise he owes anyway, in faithfulness to his ordination promises. And again, and even though we did not vote upon a new mechanism for reporting misconduct of a bishop or a priest or whatever, there's still a mechanism in place. We encourage the faithful. Call the law enforcement. Call the Attorney General's hotline. Call the victims assistance coordinator of the diocese.
Right.
So it's not like nothing's in place.
Right.
And there's other opportunities to do that. We just missed the opportunity because of the requested delay to formalize a new, clear commission.
Right. So just for those who maybe missed it in the previous podcast, that hotline, you can go to virginiaclergyhotline.com and you can make a report there to the Attorney General. And then for our victim assistance coordinator, the phone number is 703-841-3847. Bishop, one of the things that was voted on there was a proposal that would have sent a message of encouragement to the Holy Father to release documents related to Archbishop McCarrick. It was not clear what release would have meant. There was a lot of things that were unclear about exactly how that would be handled, who that would be released to, what documents, if there'd be sensitivities to, victim statements and victim information. But we've received some questions about how you voted, where you stand on that issue. You've addressed the Archbishop McCarrick situation in previous podcasts, but would you kind of address that line of question?
Sure. One of the things that was very apparent, and again, this was for our viewers to watch on television.
Right.
So they saw this. One of the things that was very prevalent at the meeting and discussions was the same thing that every bishop was hearing out in his listening sessions. There is a great deal of anger over the Archbishop McCarrick situation. And we heard bishops reflect that anger personally, and I share in that. How did this happen? And who knew what? And how was this able to go on? There are many questions that need to be answered. And until they are, there is a great deal of unsettlement. And you heard bishops say that, not only representing the faithful, because we all heard that, but representing ourselves. And we feel very, very strongly about that. And it was already made known to the Holy See. It was voiced very strongly and clearly at this meeting. And it is something that Cardinal DiNardo will be bringing to his meeting in February.
That's a great point.
So the proposal it really was an encouragement for the Holy See to do this investigation in a timely manner. And so it did not get passed, not because we don't believe this is a very serious situation and it needs to be resolved and questions need to be answered, but because the proposal was merely encouraging the Holy See to do what they have promised to do and are doing. So like in October 6th, for example, we received, and one of the bishops read the document from the Holy See. Yes, we understand this, and this needs to be investigated thoroughly, deliberately, definitively, including as many people as possible within the investigation. And files need to be part of that being open so we can get to the truth and allow that to lead us wherever the truth is. And so the Holy See, almost a month ago, said, absolutely, we are doing it. So I think one of the reasons the proposal, did not pass was because it was basically just encouraging the Holy See to do what they said they were going to do.
And the Vatican, or the Holy Father specifically, said he'll go where the truth takes him on that. And there's a Vatican investigation that's going on right now, but aren't there also diocesan investigations in the dioceses where abuse allegedly occurred?
In the four dioceses where Archbishop McCarrick served, there's investigations. And again, these are investigations. Now, I am, like probably most of our listeners, saying, well, let's go. We want answers and we want them quickly. That's our nature, But it's an investigation, and those things take a great deal of time if you're going to do them correctly. So I don't think there's a sense of there's no lack of urgency. And the proposal, even the bishop who made the proposal said, well, this really doesn't add anything. It's just a nice thing to do, So I didn't feel a strong need to give support to that. But to hear our voice, and I'm telling you, and again, our people who are watching heard it. Yes, we share the same thing you do. You feel. This needs to be answered and resolved, and it may be painful, but the truth, the truth will always win out there.
And last question on this topic. So the Vatican announced a delay in the vote regarding the reforms. But one thing that we've heard from parishioners and lay leaders is that they want to know what you're committed to. Obviously, you were ordained in 2002 when the charter and the norms were brought forward. So you've never had a different playbook, as you've said. You've always had that same playbook. But how? Just briefly cover maybe what you're committed to personally with regard to allegations against bishops or priests or whatever it might be.
Yeah, everything. I mean, again, any allegation against a clergy, a brother bishop, whatever, we have to bring it forward, and we promise to do that by first giving it to law enforcement. That's the first thing that we do. Every investigation would involve lay people with expertise to assist us in carrying out that investigation. Any credible accusation leads to zero tolerance in ministry. Ongoing support for victims to help them in the healing process, to meet with them individually, to meet with them as a group. all must be continued. Our fierce training of anyone working with children so that they're prepared and then go through the necessary training. All those things we recommit ourselves to and can never tire of doing that work.
So anyone that would like to see the video of the bishop's discussion of these issues from the USCCB, all of our policies, procedures, previous statements, and podcasts, go to arlingtondiocese.org/child protection, and you can see anything that we've done is there. Notices about allegations are there. You can find all that at arlingtondiocese.org/child protection. Lastly, the USCCB approved the publication of a document at this General Assembly on racism, and it's titled "Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love, a Pastoral Letter Against Racism." Talk a little bit about what's contained in this document.
Yeah, it's a very powerful document. Against racism. It certainly acknowledges that we need, sadly, to acknowledge the history of racism within our church, within our country, not only in history, but in present-day forms too. And to state very clearly that any form of racism, prejudice, must be eradicated. We have to identify what the root causes of that may be. Means to transform hearts so that that racism is not reflected in our behavior, in our words, in our deeds. It's a respect life topic because it goes to the dignity and value of every single person. For we are all created in the image and likeness of God, and no exception, and must treat each other in the same way. So it's of course a hard stance against any form of racism, and a commitment, to bring about all persons being treated respectfully. I'm very pleased that the pastoral letter, sometimes you issue these pastoral letters and they become a little book and they get on a shelf,
Right.
That we want to make sure that does not happen. And so there will be, for example, lesson plans for students from K to seniors in high school that will be distributed to our educators and faith formation people. We will use various forms of social media to get excerpts of the letter out, discussion items, so encouraging parishes and their groups to take this document and make sure it's not just something that sits on the shelf, but really to discuss it and how does that impact our lives? How does that impact our parish? So we want it to be a living document, and we're going to use every means possible to do that.
Very good. So we've got two questions from the faithful kind of related to this topic. Irene Zazo from Our Lady of Good Counsel says, how does the bishop manage the sexual abuse crisis in the church on a daily basis? I think given all the other responsibilities you have and keeping everything else going, how do you manage this day to day?
So you need a great deal of help. It always has to be in the forefront because this is the critical issue of our time. So it's always on the forefront, front burner. I rely on the help and support, of course, of those assisting me, both with our Victims Assistance Office and our outreach to victims, also with our Child and Youth Protection Office, making sure that background checks, training, all those things are taken into place. So it's a priority for the church, it's a priority for the diocese. With the help of many people, staff and volunteers, it stays on the front burner there.
And then John from the Basilica of St. Mary in Alexandria, what are some of Bishop Burbidge's responsibilities as the communications chair for the USCCB?
Right, which exactly began yesterday at the end of the meeting. So when I was elected last year, I wasn't quite sure this will be the time we be dealing with some of these issues. But first of all, it's important to note that I am not the communications director for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Right.
There's a staff there. I'm a chair of a committee. So all the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, there's different committees, whether it be for education, worship, evangelization, domestic policies, or whatever. And there's a bishop chair who works very closely, really day to day with the staff. So in a sense, that staff now, I'm the bishop to whom they report for the next 3 years. So I'll be intimately involved with the great work of that staff in promoting the works of the conference and then promoting the works of all the committees, in getting statements and policies that are approved out and known, working closely with the media. And so as the bishop chair, I work with a really talented group of individuals who assist in the daily operations of the communications efforts of the conference.
Very good. And just any final thoughts then, if you would send us off with your blessing.
No, well, thank you all very much for listening to this podcast. It's an opportunity for me, to the best of my ability, to share with you my reflection of what happened at our General Assembly. While there was initial disappointment, I can assure you that we did progress forward in our discussions and in our renewal and commitment of what we know has to be done at this time in our church, and ask for your continued prayers. Also, dear friends, next week we will be celebrating Thanksgiving. It's always a great time, isn't it, to be with family and friends? But we have to, and I'm so happy that in our diocese and elsewhere, so many people are now beginning Thanksgiving Day with Mass. It's so beautiful that in our parishes we have Mass Thanksgiving Day, and the crowds. I said, what a beautiful reflection that is, that we begin that day by offering the perfect act of thanks, the Eucharist, and giving thanks to God for the blessings and the gifts and the special people in our lives that so easily we can take for granted. So to really begin that day, whether at Mass or in your own personal prayer, offering thanks to the one who is the source of all good gifts. And to remember, of course, those who will not be with family and friends and who lack the basic necessities of life, to remember them in our prayers and to our great outreach and continued service to them. So I wish all of our listeners a very happy Thanksgiving filled with abundant blessings, and pray for God's grace that together we may continue to walk humbly with our God. Thank you for listening to the Walk Humbly podcast. Make sure you check out more episodes on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. You can follow me on Twitter at Bishop Burbidge, where I offer spiritual reflections each morning in the gospel and share photos and updates of what is going on in the Diocese of Arlington. Stay up to date with news, event information, inspirational content, and more by subscribing to our e-newsletter at arlingtondiocese.org.